listening to the Business and Tech Podcast, your go-to source for all the tech needs in your business. Now, here's your host, tech guru, and CEO, Jack Garzella.
Okay, on today's podcast, we have Rob Martin, not to be confused with Rob Heitman. So Rob Martin is somebody I met about a year ago through JT Fox's Founders Organization. Rob and I are both come from a technical business background, and we do a lot of the vetting of technical or tech deals that come through the founders, a few a month. So that's where I met Rob. We've gotten to know each other. I really like working with him. Rob has a similar career to mine. Now, mid-career, I kind of switched into more sales and executive management and kind of at the higher levels, CEO, VP of sales, things like that. Whereas Rob stayed more on the technical side, working his way up into enterprise architect and CTO and those types of positions. If you look at our resumes, they're very similar. 2, 3, 4, and 5-year stints at companies, solving big problems, implementing big systems, and then moving on to the next challenge, whether that be with that company or the next company. He's got a great career in solving lots of complex, large system problems, as well as some smaller companies and just helping them grow. So really looking forward to talking with Rob today. We'll probably have him on a few more times on the podcast, bringing out his expertise. And today he and I are just going to talk about how to ensure that your teams are successful, your business teams, your IT teams, putting those things together, and then ensuring that those IT teams are productive. So that's kind of what we concentrate on today, but we do kind of go all over the map. So hope you enjoy it, and we'll talk to you later. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. Okay, well, today we have Rob Martin. Rob is an enterprise solutions architect working for Deloitte. He also kind of has his own consulting firm, similar to me on the sides, when he gets a particular call or between jobs over his career. But if you looked at Rob's career on LinkedIn and you looked at my career, they'd be very similar from the perspective of we've always had 2-year to 5-year kind of stints at various companies solving large projects. So, and large, big problems. And we've both straddled that business and technical world. So with that, Rob, you want to say hi, introduce yourself quickly? You're East Coast, right?
Yeah, welcome. Hi, Jack. Yeah, I'm in Boston, Massachusetts on the East Coast, and you cover the West Coast and the mountains. It's great to have East meets West here. And yeah, I think you have a very important topic here about, how to, as a technology person, be able to speak the business and translate back and forth. There's a lot of people that say they can do it, and it's not done well. And I think you and I are some of that elite crew that can do that successfully, as we've shown through our careers.
Correct. So with that, let's talk first about kind of your background, just for people that don't want to go out to LinkedIn and do that. But you've done a lot of large solutions. With various technologies, both Oracle and stuff, as well as with regular, I don't know what you want to call it, web services, things like that, and then a lot of cloud. Correct. So just give us like 2 minutes on kind of the background of some of the technologies and projects.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of working with some large companies in finance, healthcare, data analytics, consumer products, and working from everything from the infrastructure as companies set up data centers and as they've transitioned to the cloud, to how do you get these SaaS systems, as everybody wants to use a CRM model, and then they want their finance model and then their manufacturing model, all in different clouds, but they all have to share the same data and translations and mappings. And so it really worked everywhere around the full stack. What is your data running on? How do you secure it? And that's a big piece of it is that data security, as everybody talks about today. And a lot of times when you're working with developers, they're not always thinking about that, but you got to be thinking about that from the beginning. And I think one of the other big transitions, and it might be another topic, is it used to be we think about securing the system and securing the building. And now we have to think about securing a specific data field. You're at all the way down to
Right.
the data fields. And, certain people can see it and certain people can't. And it used
Yep.
to be like, do you even have access to the system? If you had access, you had access to everything.
Right.
And how we've moved to having to secure, portions.
That shows our how long we've been in this field, right? Because it used to be system access, then it was row level access, and now it's field level access within my client base, my sale. I'm a sales guy, I can only see my customers. It's gotten really refined from that perspective. And then you layer on cloud security and everything else on top of that. It gets pretty messy pretty fast.
Yep.
Good. So one topic I want to cover, and we talked about covering before this, was, in my career, I've really made my money talking business and talking tech, sometimes in the same meeting with the CFO, the COO, sitting on one side of the table, and the lead DBA and the lead architect and the CIO sitting at the other end of the table, bringing those two guys together, whether I was working for that company or whether I was a vendor implementing a solution. So I know you've had some specific thoughts on when to use the different conversations and how. So I'll just let you take off with that a little bit here.
Yeah, let me start with a story. A very similar situation. We were talking with a big box store retailer about solving a particular problem and working with a consulting company. And we said, hey, yeah, we've got the solution. And they had talked with all the salespeople. They talked with the executive at the company, and they were kind of sold on the solution, but they're like questioning whether we had the technical chops to implement it, and we really understood their system and their problems and things like that. And we actually were sitting around the boardroom, and their CEO had talked and said their problem, and I started talking, and they introduced their lead DBA and their lead technical person. And the funny thing was, we started talking and we started getting into the nitty gritty of it. And all the business and salespeople, their eyes just started glazing over. They tuned out. They're like, okay, this is that geek tech talk. And we got it about 10, 15 minutes in, and they're like, okay, can you guys bring it back to us here? And the CEO looked over to his tech guy, and there was just kind of this nod and exchange of, yes, this guy's got it, he understands it. And then I had to switch and say, and this is how you're going to see the benefits that you're looking for.
Right.
And I had to then switch out of the technical and flip back, and because everybody's like, what do I get out of it?
Yep.
How is this going to help me solve a problem, do something faster, better, cheaper? And if you're talking to the CFO, you got to be talking about, what's my return on investment? How much money is this going to take me? Is this CapEx versus OpEx, right? Those finance numbers. Then you talk to the sales and the operations people, and you're like, how am I going to get this done faster? How is this going to make sure that I'm not slowed down? And you got to talk into those business benefits all in the same conversation. And it was like, okay, once they had the sign off from their tech person that they trust, and everybody's got a tech person they trust, right?
Yes.
And every new tech salesperson has to come in and tell you how they're better and how you have to trust them. And they usually have to tell you how the last guy wasn't as good and gave you bad advice, right?
Exactly.
Whether you do it directly or not. But there was like a perfect example of, you start out with that business mindset. Do you understand the solution? And you always see the little bit of we don't totally trust the sales guy. Yeah, the sales guy is using the lingo, he's using the words, but he's a sales guy. And they want to talk tech guy to tech guy and have that confidence, and then flip it back to the business. And then they have to come in and negotiate the deal and the terms and get the signature, and then you got to implement.
So talk us through your approach to, or your best practices might be a better way to say it. On the front side of a project, you're kind of talking about that now, where you've got both in the room and you're trying to get things going. But as the project moves on, requirements may or may not change, delivery schedules may or may not change, hopefully budgets stay similar. but talk us through kind of how you managed both sides of that relationship, both sides of those communications as you work through some of the, because a lot of the projects you and I do, the big ones at least, they're many months, if not a year or two, by the time
Yep.
the whole thing gets implemented, right? You're doing it incrementally in most cases, but yeah, so walk us
Yeah.
through that.
So this is probably one of the areas that a lot of other tech people don't necessarily agree. No matter how big the problem is, it could be a 3-year project, but when you're starting it out and throughout, you will find out there's no more than 6 to 12 real core business requirements. And the problem is the people that you're talking to, they haven't distilled it down to that. And so as an enterprise architect, as a requirements gatherer, your job is to listen as they say, well, I want to do this. I want this here. I want that there. I want this to go over here. You have to distill that out to what are they really saying the problem is and what is the real use case. And it's funny when we talk about the agile versus waterfall methods and things like that. And the real big difference is the terminology. So in waterfall method, it's like, oh, we got to have the business requirement and it still comes down to business requirement. You talk agile, they're like, we need the user story. And I'm like, you gather all the user stories and what you're going to do is then say, I need to do this. But it's the same thing. What is the core problem? And I've been on projects where we've gathered 200, 300, 500 different requirements. And what you need to do as an architect, or even just as a solution provider, doesn't matter, if you're on that technical side, is group those down and go, what are they really? And you got to pull out the pieces, the nuggets. And I'm sure you've seen this. And then once you've done that, you have to repeat that back to the business user and get their confirmation and get them to understand that you've really understood, you've captured everything, and get their buy off, because nobody can manage 200 to 300 requirements, but everybody can manage 6 to 10 to 12. And what that does is it really crystallizes what are the problems. Now, all those other requirements are variations. You're not losing them, you're not forgetting them. They're just variations of the same thing. And you group them and you track them, right? And I see you nodding. But,
It could be it's absolutely right. And I look back, back in the 90s, we used to do that, right? We used to do 300, 400, 500 requirements and then try to distill it down into phases or whatever. We weren't using waterfall back then. We kind of moved off of that, but agile didn't exist back then, at least the way we think of it today. And there's so many mixed methods that people use today, depending on, are they a startup company or corporation, whatever. But to your point, it's never take these 400 things and try and implement all 400, right? And especially lately, when I say lately, the last 5-7 years, I've really been an advocate of get the screens out in front of the user as fast as possible, even if all the business logic's not behind it yet, because they will give you better feedback if they see something versus just talking about it.
Oh, 100%. And for anybody, especially, the tech minded that, want to have something in front of them and have it crystallized. I don't be afraid to put something out there that people can say, no, that's wrong. I find that if you talk about putting screens,
right.
I'll mock something up.
Yeah.
And, they're like, but you had 10-minute conversation. How can you mock something up? I'm like, I just put it together. Think about how, if I was in their shoes.
Right.
And it's the ability to put your hands on it, virtually, right? This is how it's going to look. And then you go to this screen. And like you say, once they have something in front of them, it's so much easier for them to say, this is good, this is bad, change this, change that. It just gives everybody a starting point to work from and refine it.
And in many cases, I don't know how often you've done this. I found myself doing this a lot the last 7 to 10 years is I'll mock it up in PowerPoint, Lucid Chart, some tool. I won't have my coders code the screen.
No.
And my designers hate that because they want to look at how the buttons, the button runda, does it have square corners? I'm like, I don't give a crap. I want to know,
Yeah.
are these the fields they need? Are these the buttons they need? And is this the business logic they're expecting on the next screen? Go ahead.
Oh yeah, they're like, oh, let's put a UML diagram together, and I'm like, no, you just. I've done it in Excel. I've done it in PowerPoint.
Yeah.
I've done it in Lucid Charts, Visio. Just have something. And the second thing is, it's not just one screen to the other. It's the business process flow.
Yeah.
And where that's super important is you be surprised the number of companies that have these silos and walls between departments.
Yep.
There's the sales team that throws it over to the finance team to make sure that they gets paid, and then it gets thrown over to the manufacturing and shipping team, and then that gets thrown to the suppliers, and you work with companies. I know you've worked with companies that have long lead times.
Yeah.
I've worked with companies where some of their raw materials lead times is 9 to 12 months.
Yeah.
And then, you work with these digital companies, and, lead time is almost nothing, because it's like, hey, you want to make a new skin. I worked for a large gaming company. I'm trying not to say the name, but
That's right.
A large gaming company, and their average transaction was like $1 to $5.
Right.
But they were doing multi-billion-dollar global business, and so they had to deal with interchanges and stuff. So their supply cycle was, hey, how quickly can I build a new skin, a new model, a new design that we're going to sell? And it's a totally different model, but the problems are all the same.
Yep.
You got to be able to put it out there. You got to sell it. You got to account for it. You got to supply it and make sure it's delivered, and make sure that you collected on it.
So let's talk a little bit about how we approach these systems, because we've got agreement from the business that this is what they want. We think we know how to build it with the technical guys, but the magic's in the middle. And in large corporations, you're dealing with silos. In smaller companies, you're dealing with hidden business logic or assumed rules and all kinds of stuff that comes up because everybody's moving fast, like you're saying. Let's put this in tomorrow. Let's get this in 3 days, right? Barely any testing. I always approach it from data. Is the data flow going to support the business logic and the business rules? Because I can always slap whatever screen, whatever reporting tool, whatever on top of it, as long as the data flows right and the data structures are right. What's your approach?
Definitely, data is your foundation, and I think companies as a whole realize their gold, their secret sauce is their data, whether it's about their customers, their suppliers, and the process. But I think the key to kind of talk about that communication is, once you've gathered the requirements across the process and you've distilled it down, and you're, of course, as a agile method, you're going to prioritize. So even if you can see steps 2, 3, 4 down the road, you don't wait until you have the full definition of all those next steps. You're going to start on that number one priority. The key thing as an architect, as a technical solution architect, is to then take, hey, you've got 5, 6 screens, these data elements. You then have to put the rest of the package and put the specifics to these technically minded people that take everything almost literally to what you say, and you have to spell out to that level of detail. Look, I need these data fields, and these have to be secured, and this data, a lot of times it's like, where is it coming from? Is it coming from a user import?
Right.
Am I getting it from another system? If I'm getting it from another system, how am I getting at that? Is that a web service? Am I using, you have to define,
real time? Is it batch? How am I getting it? Right. Yeah.
Real-time batch. Am I, token security or username password? Am I REST? Am I FTP? Am I SOAP? You have to be able to drive into those details, and you're not always going to get that from the same source on who's giving you the data. You have to talk to 5, 6 different people, but then you have to spell it out to that 1 or 2 top developers that you're working with. And you usually have a UX person, and you have a middleware person, and then you have that developer coder person. And you have to, it's funny because they're like, hey, do you have experience with HTML? Do you have experience with
Right.
Python? Do you have experience with Java? Do you know, Microsoft code? And it's like, it doesn't matter because the logic is the same.
Yeah.
In the developer, you pay them to have the skill set of what specific language.
Yeah.
And, you know, once you learn half a dozen different languages, you can, you know, give me a new language like Python. You know, they call it new, right? It's newer, it's gaining
Yeah.
in fashion, right? And the funny thing is it looks like it's structured a lot like C. You know,
Yeah.
include this, include that. Here's a little.
Well, Rob and I, the other Rob Heitman, who is a semi-regular on this podcast, he and I, it hasn't, as of the time of us recording this, it's not out on the podcast yet, but it'll be out there either right before or right after this episode. We did one on outsourcing, insourcing. Okay. And how a mixed, you know, a lot of growth companies are using mixed models just because they can't staff up fast enough and how to manage that. Now, I want to take this from a different perspective with you, not so much the offshore onshore thing, which is what we were talking about more, but how you deal with your teams across, you know, when you're dealing with the larger corporations, which more recently you have. I should say that you've done that all your career, but in your current projects, I guess is a better way to say it. You know, you might have, you know, I think I managed 400 people at one point on a project, and you've got to have good project managers. You've got to have, you know, good project status, but you've also got to make sure that you're not in meetings to have meetings, to have status, to have meetings, right? Those coders need to be coding. They're expensive. They're getting more expensive. So just how do you manage state status and then just, you know, you got 3 DBAs, you got maybe 10 web developers, you got 5 middleware guys. Just what do you see on that and what's your approach?
Yeah, I really see the tools that we have nowadays, like Slack and Jira and other tools that are similar to this, where you can lay out your requirements and break them down. And that's where you need a project manager that really understands things and, you know, the dependency, because, but the point being, you can lay out down to specific tasks. You put the developer on the task and you have them using those tools communicate what is the status, how am I going, and it has to have, you know, look, this is the task, I expect it to take 5 days, or I expect it to take 3 days, and they have to agree. And that's part of the big thing is,
Right.
you know, you're planning things out,
Right.
but if you say it's going to take 3 days and the developer says it's going to take 10 days, you got to go, you got to dive into that and you got to get to an agreement.
Yeah. A lot of times the requirements are a mismatch. They don't understand what you're asking. They think it's bigger. Vice versa, you're missing something that they're saying they've got to do that you didn't think they had to do. I have that almost weekly in my aviation software company because
Oh yeah,
my product manager used to be a chief pilot. He's, you know, flies huge helicopters. He talks like a business person. My developer will say
yep,
2 weeks, and I'll get in the middle of it. It'll end up being a week. Yeah.
right. Well, and you know, they want to build themselves in some slack time. They want to build in some test
Always.
time, and you know, but one of the key things that I do is I always pair up the developers.
Hmm.
Because no matter how good of a developer you are, you're going to run into something where it's just not working. And I've done this myself. It's not working. It's not working. And what I do is I pair them up and say, if you're stuck on something for more than an hour or two, you call your buddy
Yeah.
and you have to explain to them what it is you're trying to do and what's not working. And you got to show your screen. You got to walk through the code. And what happens every single time, not every single time, I'd say probably 80 to 90% of the time, is as you're explaining it to the other person, you find your problem.
Right.
The other 20% of the time, the other person is like, hey, you missed something on this line of code. Or, you know, why are you doing it this way? And
Yeah.
it's just that question that other perspective that goes, boom, I didn't see it that way. And then you solve the problem. Because what'll happen is you get the developer that's like, I'm stuck on this, and he spends 3 days stuck on it, and he doesn't told anybody.
Yeah. Now it's interesting you say that. I hadn't thought about that, but I found myself doing that in my various projects, but I'd never thought about calling it pairing, right? We use React a lot, and React has all kinds of funny issues where it'll update and sometimes it won't update. And, we'll get a bug notice in from a client. Hey, this didn't update on the system, but the other 100 times we did it today, it did. Why didn't it do it on the 101st time? And Rob and David will have to get together and do a little code tracing and figure out where that call could have got stuck, right? Or whatever,
Yep.
because all this stuff's supposed to be auto retry, it's supposed to be auto fix, but it's technology, it breaks.
Yeah. And we're in, distributed systems so much. And you always get the update in that one system. It's like, oh, this shouldn't affect anything else.
Right.
And it does. But yep. Yeah, that's the thing, as needing to communicate, and I'm trying to keep the theme here is communication.
Yeah.
And translating, even when the other person doesn't understand what it is you're trying to do, but they have that technical skill set. They may not understand the business problem. They may not know the connections and the data. But if your one developer respects the other developer's technical knowledge,
yep,
having that communication and conversation gets them from being stuck for a day or two to being stuck for an hour or two.
Well, and just to close off that topic, I'll add in, I've had to do that on the business side. The CFO has these 5 high-level goals, or the chief of marketing person or salesperson. They hand it off to their team, right, to run the project day to day with the tech team. And then I'll find that they've went sideways, or maybe they're over baking the cake, if you will, or whatever. And I'll have to pull that business executive back in to get them on the same page as to what the goals are, so that we're not overcooking the solution and driving costs and timelines up. Very similar to developers, right? Because
well, it's that scope creep, and that's why I come back to that core 10 to 12 requirements.
Yeah.
Because then they're like, oh, but this means this encompasses this, that, and the other, and it's like, no, let's crystallize it. Let's agree on the core fundamental problems, and then when you start going sideways, you're like, does this solve my core problem? If it doesn't help solve the core problem, then no, it's not part of the solution.
You got it. Hey, Rob and David want to do a little bake-off on technology. I think I'll add you into that podcast. It'll be a little bit of fun. It'll be about 45 minutes on what's your favorite technologies and why, and why do you hate these other ones, right? And it's not so much to say one technology is better than another, but I'm always dealing with this stuff, and I only want that I want it for the technical guys to kind of hear different opinions, because they all get in love with their technology. But on the same side, the business guys to kind of hear the argument, not that they might understand it, but they understand what's noise versus what's real, right?
Exactly.
So in our last minute here, I'll invite you into that one here that we're going to do. Well, probably in about 2 weeks, we'll have that one. So
I'd love to continue that conversation with you.
Hey, well, thanks for joining us today. I'm sure we'll have you back if you're willing. And this was great info for the listeners, and really appreciate your time. Any last thoughts?
No, I really enjoyed talking with you, and I think the focus is, understanding and keeping the communication clear.
Perfect. All right, we'll talk to you later, Rob. Thanks a lot.